Welcome to Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk series. My name is Claire Haley. I am our Vice President of Public Relations and Programs here for the History Center. And it's just my absolute pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event featuring author Jerad Alexander for his new book, Volunteers Growing Up in the Forever War. And it actually just hit bookshelves today. So if you haven't yet gotten your copy, we'll be posting a link to do that in the chat from Atlanta History Center's museum store. For tonight only, for participants only, we're offering 25% off the book. So it's a great time to grab your copy. And you can either have that shipped to you, or if you're here in Atlanta, you can come pick it up from us too. So we hope that you'll consider supporting Jerad and his newly published book. And we hope that this conversation will pique your interest. And there's always more where all this comes from, right, in the book. So we hope that you'll pick up your copy this evening. We're joined, of course, by Jerad Alexander, tonight's featured author. He's written for a variety of publications, including Esquire, Rolling Stone, The Nation, and elsewhere. He hosts an MFA from New York University, where he's joining us from New York this evening. And from 1998 to 2006, he served as a U.S. Marine, deploying to the Mediterranean, East Africa, and Iraq. He grew up on military bases from the East Coast of the United States all the way to Japan, and he currently, as we said, lives in New York City. He is joined in conversation by local journalist Chris Quinn, who you all are probably familiar with if you're in Atlanta. He's been working for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution for many, many years and does excellent work there, doing watchdog reporting on Atlanta Veterans Hospital and writing occasional features about veterans. And he also covers economic issues and the growth of high-tech enterprise in Metro Atlanta. And he has been a journalist for 32 years. So doing so much for local news here in Atlanta. So we're just thrilled that he's joining us tonight. So again, welcome. As Chris and Jerad are talking, if you have questions, you can drop those in the Q&A, and we will be answering as many of those as possible at the end of the talk this evening. And so Chris, Jerad, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks so much for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. It's great to be here. Thanks for saying I've been here for many, many, many years. It makes me feel really old. But it's true, I have been here for many years. As all of those years that I've been in Atlanta, 23, we have been involved heavily with militarily in the Middle East. And so when I think about Jerad's title to his book, Growing Up in the Forever War, it really hits home because I had forgotten really my brother-in-law going over to the first Gulf incursion and then living through 9/11 here in Atlanta. And here we are still, decades later, still involved in the war. So I think that the title is spot on. I've read the book. It's quite a good tale. And it's like any good story, it's about change. Without change, there's really not a story. It's just a collection of facts and events. So Jerad gives us this story, not just his time in the service, but it's essentially an autobiography from his youth in his teenage years to his induction in the Marines, right on through to his service for many years out of action and then going into action in the Middle East. And now then he's standing outside of that bubble as a writer, thinking back on it and how it affected him, how it changed the world. So for those of you who haven't read the book or don't know much about it, Jerad is not just a Marine. He was raised on Air Force bases across the U.S. and also in Japan. So he's a creature of the military fully. And now that he's standing outside of that military bubble, reflecting on his 8 years of service, and you can see a lot of work went into the work and that he's bringing us here tonight, glimpses of who he was, who he became, and how that all happened. Again, stories of change, which are always the most interesting things. So starting out with your youth, Jerad, I'd like you to sort of start at the beginning somewhere, at least in your youth. So I pulled out a section from page 41, starting at the second paragraph. Could you read that for us, please, and give us a sense of sort of how you're starting and where you came from?
Sure, yeah, thank you. I'll start with the reading here. The war was filtered through 80s action flicks and the Pledge of Allegiance and the Star-Spangled Banner, and commercials hawking Air Jordans, Mitchum deodorant, and Diet Pepsi. When our bombs fell, I imagined the bad guys were tossed from their sandbag bunkers in front of a burst of stuntman pyrotechnics, their arms flailing, their rifles tossed entirely in slow motion. Their bodies did not come apart. They just flew like olive drab rag dolls. And when they landed, they were dead as if asleep with their eyes open. They died like I died on the playground or in the neighborhood when we played war and pantomimed action hero manhood. Someone would say bang or pow, and I would spin, eyes clenched, face to the sky, mouth wide in a Wilhelm scream, and fall dramatically into the snow. At 10 years old, the Persian Gulf War sounded like Guns N' Roses' Welcome to the Jungle. It sounded like Bon Jovi's Wanted Dead or Alive. It sounded like the Clash's Rock the Casbah. I listened to AC/DC's For Those About to Rock and Thunderstruck on the radio in my bedroom, chanting along with the pictures of fighter jets screaming across my mind.
Jerad, it's interesting, I think, that you start with this memoir of a war in your youth. So why did you need to write vignettes about your youth and some of your earliest memories? What role does that play in the story that you're trying to tell here?
You know, when I initially set out to write this, I wanted to write a war story about Iraq specifically, in a very rote and almost overdone manner, quite frankly. But the further along I got, I realized that my war effectively started in childhood, and that the formations, the key elements in the bedrock of my time in the military starts watching war as a kid, being around fighter jets, being exposed to it in film and television, and quite frankly, in music. And so I felt the longer I went, the more I realized that that's where the war really lived. And the me going to war was the product of all those experiences and events.
As a child growing up in the military, do you think that lifestyle sort of automatically groomed you for a life in the military? And was that your experience, that your friends that were also military-based kids ended up going into the service?
I think so. I absolutely. I mean, they did a survey of service members and their motivations for enlisting, and I think it was around 60 to 70% of them could draw a straight line to a family member or someone very close in their childhood that was in the military. I just happened to be a little bit more broad for me, in that everyone I knew was in the military, just about, even grandparents and distant relatives. All the school kids that I played with in the neighborhoods, their parents were military. When my parents threw parties, they were all military. You know, it was a natural part of the backdrop, and you kind of aspired to it to a degree. I certainly did, and a lot of people that I know in that world did. So yes, I mean, you were effectively being dipped in that culture from the start, and it was hard not to think of doing anything else. It's hard to think of doing anything else, rather.
Mhm. Was patriotism something that was talked about a lot in your house and in that culture, or was that something that was simply worn on the shirt sleeve and accepted as just part of the norm there? Or was it emphasized, talked about, taught to you?
Not in the home, it wasn't. My parents have a tendency to keep their service small. They don't broadcast it, and they didn't then. I mean, my stepdad put his uniform on, went to work, came home, and took it off, and then spent the rest of the day just sort of living his life, and as anyone would. There was not a lot of flag waving in my house. I saw a little bit more of that in school, especially during the Gulf War. There were, the yellow ribbons tied to trees, and a lot of American flags fluttering, and the Pledge of Allegiance every morning. And there was a lot of sort of baked in patriotism, and or maybe quite frankly just misunderstood patriotism in those environments, because kids are hard to sort of, they understand what that means. They're just sort of growing into that, but not so much in the home. It was just something that was assumed in the background.
Mm-hmm. And if you would go back to the book, and first go back to your first reading from the book. That was when the Gulf War first broke out, correct?
Absolutely. It was just after it started. That scene would have taken place probably in February of 91, March of 91.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Okay. Going to page 44 in your book, to give us another taste of your writing, would you start at the second paragraph down that starts a few weeks later and read a couple of paragraphs there?
Certainly. A few weeks later, my fifth grade class was tapped to participate in a massive recital. Normally, these things happened over Christmas time, when various teachers ran us through Silent Night and Jingle Bells, which made us all groan with malaise until Christmas break finally freed us from its dumb pageantry. But this time we would sing in tribute of all the troops who went to the desert. Our class learned America, my country, 'tis of thee. America the beautiful. My God bless America. And finally, God bless the USA by the Marlboro Man of Cheap Patriotism, Lee Greenwood. Instead of belting out these jams to a small pond of fold-out chairs in our own cheap gymnasium, however, we would perform this for a cross-section of the Air Force community on the main stage of the big high school, just outside the air base, a complete theater with plush fold-out seating, stage lighting, and an audio system. We rehearsed furiously. We wanted to be good. When the time came, we were bused to the high school and sent to our assigned seats in the audience. The auditorium was packed with airmen from the base, many in uniform. Fathers and mothers filled the seats while teenagers ditched class and snickered as they watched through the gaps and narrow windows of the main doors. Our class was called forward and we marched to the stage and carefully filed onto the narrow metal benches of the fold-out bleachers. The stage lights were warm. The audience was a blur of dark shapes. My stepdad was out there, but I wasn't sure where. The rising sounds of the first song echoed across the theater. Our conductor marked the tempo with her baton and we began to sing. Many in the audience sang along with us. We didn't sing for the relief of Ethiopian famines, or for Israeli-Palestinian peace, or for the end of apartheid. We didn't sing for the end of poverty or racism or sexism. Instead, we sang old songs that carried flags across battlefields and graves and the thousands of old bones of the red, white, and victorious. Our prepubescent voices harmonized the exaltations that only those who believe they are the best can truly manage. We sang praise for our superpower victory over the forces of a tin pot dictator 7,000 miles away. By the time we got to Lee Greenwood, we were in a state of evangelical euphoria, shouting with a rage as hot as the afterburner of a fighting falcon and the shrapnel of its cluster bombs. We sang like a warning, and our voices reverberated throughout the theater and down the halls of the high school, through the bathroom cigarette smoke and the geek whiff of the science lab ozone, out the big main doors and into the American springtime air, announcing that Iraq was at the center of our ire now, and that we would be at war with the desert in our hearts forever.
Was that before or after your dad was called, or your stepdad was called up and sent to the Mideast? You recall?
It was after he returned, probably
after
about
the
a month
later.
later. Mm-hmm. It was
Yeah.
like April of '91.
Yeah. You mentioned cheap patriotism in the section of that reading. How do you define that cheap patriotism, and how is that different from real patriotism? Because as you read that, you can read the passion in the words like you believed it then, or what was you recall what your thoughts were at that time about patriotism and what it meant?
Well, in my view, real patriotism is quiet and unassuming and humble. It is inclusive. It brings everybody into the fold, and it celebrates the common identity. Cheap patriotism is loud and showy. Cheap patriotism has a production budget, quite frankly. It's meant to be performative, but it has no real value or meaning at the end.
Your experience in growing up on military bases and then later in the military, do you have a sense of how that plays out among those who are in it, or are most of those sort of true believers in the flag waving type patriotism, or is there a deeper level of understanding and meaningfulness among the soldiers, the boots on the ground, particularly?
I think there is. I think that the people who go off to fight our wars, when they come home, they realize what America is in context of the world, both its good and its bad. There is I can speak for myself in that way. I remember when I returned home from the Iraq War, I was awed by the size of the country. I was awed by our abilities and quite frankly, our ease of life. While there are certainly struggles in this country that need to be resolved, at the end of the day, we have it fairly easy compared to people who don't live here. And at the same time, I think that a lot of service members, they sort of exude their patriotism in small ways by simply showing up to it. There's a confidence to their patriotism. They don't feel threatened by somebody they don't feel that their patriotism isn't under threat by anyone. They have the confidence of their belief systems, and they don't feel the need to advertise it so strongly.
Mm-hmm. And going back to your youth, you write about some of your first experiences firing a gun and how that left you feeling. At the same time, you talk about how the Air Force is not one of those sort of dirt under the fingernail type services. like the Marines, like the Army. I want you to read a section of the book on page, let's see, it's page 50, beginning
Okay.
about halfway down, starting with afterward,
Mhm.
that paragraph about one of your first experiences firing a gun.
Sure.
And then I want to ask you a question about, even though you were in the Air Force, which is not really sort of the guns branch of the military, there was certainly an attraction there for you. And I'd like you to talk about sort of that attraction to guns and firearms and sort of more boots on the ground type of military service.
Sure. Afterward, I was given a chance to shoot Allen's 357 Magnum. Those bullets were long and aggressive and slid into the cylinder in a way that suggested a certain deadly refinement. When I held it in my hand, its weight seemed like pure American authority. I fired all 6 shots, each drop of the Magnum's hammer causing the weapon to kick against the palm of my hand. It felt mean and manly. It felt grown up. I sensed something primal in it, a power at the end of my thin arms, and with it in my hands, I believed I was bigger, a vindicator, a protector, a soldier, a gunfighter, an action hero, the idea of an American. After I fired my 6 shots, my stepdad brought out his 44 caliber revolver. He stood tall and lean, the big cannon in both hands, and fired 6 controlled shots. Holes nearly the size of dimes appeared in the targetry each time. A slab of bark fell from its flanks. Each shot roared across the woods in a cacophony of aggression that was scary and visceral and wonderful. When we finished shooting, my ears rang.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think later on, I end up shooting a blanks out of a machine gun. And I think that was the first indicator that I was going to go in a different direction. Now, the Air Force is a very staid environment. It's very much a 9 to 5 existence typically. Doesn't mean there's shift work, and the people who are in the Air Force are incredibly professional at what they do typically. But the nature of the work is simply just not. It's logistics and maintenance and administrative. Very few, with the exception of fighter pilots and perhaps some, pararescuemen and some similar fields like that. There's not a lot of. You're not in a hole in the ground. You're not out in the field very often. You're not at the leading edge of the American military. And as I got older and as I became a teenager, I started realizing, just by virtue of what I was reading, that my interest really lied in the weapon systems and just also being a soldier, just carrying a rifle in a war zone with a pack on my back and not much else thought to it.
Mm.
Now, the guns themselves, however, they're visceral. Anybody who's fired a weapon understands that they're loud and it's a violence that's controlled by your hand. And there is a certain atavism to that, as I mentioned. And I think that was attractive to me as a kid. And I think that's attractive to me, to a lot of boys, to be honest with you. And I was just exposed to it really early. But I was also influenced too by the films of the era. I mean, Arnold Schwarzenegger had a gun in every film he was in at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Bruce Willis and John McClane or Lethal Weapon. It was just part of the natural pop culture landscape of the world that I was in.
Mm-hmm.
So it all kind of came together in sort of,
Mm-hmm.
very, very hazy and kind of high adrenaline forms.
But kind of like most kids, I suppose, you weren't thinking about sort of where that might lead. You were thinking about the excitement, almost like a thrill ride.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And was your move into like a fighting unit, the military, inevitable, do you think, from that point and from sort of being sort of bathed in that culture and growing up in at least a military home? Or
I think
were you able to
so.
choose? Do you think you might have chosen another path, or was that inevitable for you?
I think it was inevitable. When I was a teenager, I became really fascinated with Vietnam. I watched Platoon and Hamburger Hill and Full Metal Jacket when those came out, and was kind of inspired by them. I think there was an everyman quality to the soldier that really appealed to me and still does. It's a tough job. It is a remarkably difficult job. It is especially difficult in combat, for obvious reasons. But it is also incredibly rewarding to do that work. It is a constant physical challenge. It is, and as you get up in the ranks, there is a lot to know. There's a lot to understand because your lives are depending on you knowing them. And so all those things really combined for me a sense of kind of, salt of the earth glory in a way. There was a very, my friend refers to being in the infantry as a form of sacrificial love, and I think that there's a lot of truth to that. It is a humble job, but it is a rugged job, and that not many people can do it. And if you can, there's a lot of personal pride that comes from it.
Mhm. That's part of the attraction.
Absolutely.
Hmm. Hmm. You not only spent time on bases here in the U.S., you also traveled to Japan for a number of years and were stationed there with your family. And for those who haven't read the book again, just some background is Jerad's father was Air Force, correct?
My dad and my stepdad were both Air Force, yes.
Yep. You had your father and mother, both Air Force. And then your mother left the service, but still was married to your stepfather at that point. So she was still a service wife, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So when you guys moved to Japan, I think that there's a sense of some growing awareness there of American presence, not only in the U.S., but across the world, and maybe what that meant. Would you read page 73? I think it is. Yeah, with the paragraph that starts the stops in the military career, and then end at that paragraph as well.
Sure. The stops in a military career are just waypoints across the expanse of the empire. Its residents, the temporal characters writing the spearheads of foreign and national defense policies, and the whims of generals and bureaucrats. On the edges of its empire, America becomes a separate entity, a physical and spiritual object regarded and revered, dubiously or otherwise, as a beacon of patriotic nouns: liberty, freedom, justice, democracy, and so on. Our homes abroad are the outposts of American exceptionalism.
Hmm. Hmm. How did living in a foreign culture begin to change the way that you saw the United States as a youth? Or is that writing something sort of gathered from your understanding as an adult of what you were going for or what you were going through as a youth?
I think that even at the moment, we were very aware of your presence in Japan, and one of the rules that my family and a lot of other families sort of embodied was, live small. We're in somebody else's country. Let's try to not create. Let's not be the ugly American. Those people do exist. They absolutely do. But there was a sort of quiet and unspoken push to try to, blend in, quite frankly. And for no other reason that we don't want to. We're guests in somebody else's country, and that was a huge thing. That thing was real. That aspect was really pushed on me, and I was, it was demanded that I accept that as a reality, and I did quite well. But at the same time, I also met kids who had never been to the United States outside to visit, who were Americans. They were American by birth, but had spent most of their entire childhood at one military base or another.
Mhm.
I can think of a few who went from Turkey to Germany to Greece to Korea and then to Japan. And the only time they ever went to the United States was to spend 2 or 3 weeks at a time just to visit with relatives. And
Mhm.
that is something that sticks with me a lot. And I tried to think about that as I wrote this, that
Mhm.
our empire is such that we can create a situation where Americans don't even have to be in the country. They just exist by virtue of their connection to the military away from the United States. I think that's fascinating, even to this day.
Mhm. How do you think that shapes foreigners' ideas of what the United States is and is like, foreigners who have never been to this country?
I would be lying if I said I knew that clearly. I think that in Japan there was a certain amount of, at least in the mainland, Okinawa is a very different story. But I think in the mainland there was a general acceptance to our presence. In fact, in Misawa, we had our relations with the community was really good. I never felt a sense of ire from the Japanese people. They were incredibly polite and gracious. That said, I don't know if that translates elsewhere. I know that Greece, like especially Crete, I'd gone through there when I was 20 or 19 rather, and a couple of Marines were attacked, sort of, kind of unprovoked by a few folks. So it really is conditional upon where it is. I think in Asia we were pretty well regarded, whereas elsewhere maybe not so much. I know Europe, there was a lot of goodwill between the United States and its allies and its host nations.
Mhm. In one place in the book, you write about how you joined the military to separate yourself from the average American. And then just earlier, you were talking about the strong sense of brotherhood and belonging that you get while being in the military. And earlier today, I was also talking to a veteran here in Atlanta as part of my work who has organized a women's veterans group. And she was telling me that there's a real sense of belonging, but when you leave, there's also a real sense of loneliness and dislocation. Can you talk a little bit about that? I know you talk about that some in the book, but what is your sensibility about how you deal with that sense of belonging while you're there, how that encourages you and makes you what you are, and then how much it affects you after you leave that environment?
The military is a remarkably tight tribe. I remember growing up around it, and you felt this natural separation between the civilian population around the base I lived. We had civilian friends, but they couldn't come on base. You had to go visit with them. There was this kind of inherent barrier between the two of us. Much of that was a simple matter of security. The Air Force tended to guard its, like any base, it tends to guard its perimeters. For one reason or another. And but there was also it was also ingrained into me as a Marine. When I went into the Marine Corps, my drill instructors were very adamant to instill in us this idea that we were, quite frankly, better than the average American. I've come to think that that's a flawed thinking, because what it does is it creates a sense of separation that can never be fully rejoined after you leave the military. You become part of this sort of caste system that is which can limit you, I think, in certain respects. When I left the Marine Corps, I felt a sense of alienation. I wanted to leave the Marine Corps. It was an elective choice, and I had no regrets about it. And that was not for any real cynical reason. I just was done. I had done what I wanted to do. But when I left the military, one of the things I did notice early on was that because I was a veteran, when that understanding came to other people, especially people who had not experienced it, it tended to typecast me a little bit in certain contexts. I was sort of not allowed to just kind of grow into a new person. I had to kind of carry that identity around in my back pocket. And to a certain degree, I'm fine with that, but it also meant that it might limit people's view of me. One of the things I tell veterans when I meet them is that, look, when they first get out, or they're about to get out, is I said, look, it takes nothing to be a veteran. Like you have that title bestowed on you when you leave honorably. And what else can you do? What else are you capable of doing? You've shown that you're capable of being a Marine or a soldier or what have you. Well, find something else that you can be really good at that's not that. And I think that sometimes veterans, for one, from traumatic reasons, which it needs to be respected and examined, but I think they have a tendency to feel alienated by the culture that they just simply can't reconnect to. And so they revert into these kind of groups to a certain extent. That's in a toxic way. On a positive way, veterans give you a sense of community, and they can give a sense of they can be guideposts. You can reach out to those folks and ask for guidance when navigating the world. And I have that. That's the experience that I've had with veterans typically.
You still carry that identity around in your back pocket in some degree?
I'm sorry, repeat that?
Do you still carry that identity around in your back pocket, as you said, to some degree?
A little bit, yeah. I don't think that's ever going to a trip. I've tried to expand my world a little bit and learn about other things and get involved in the arts and that sort of thing to try to counterbalance those forces with things that are an opposite to that or just different from that. But it will always be a part of my life.
Yeah. And so right out of high school, you joined the Marines, correct?
That's right.
And trained at Paris, correct? Paris Island.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. And I know that at one point you also did some service in Washington, D.C. After some anthrax letters supposedly were mailed to congressmen. I can remember that happening. I was at a niece's wedding when I got, and I was actually at a hotel, and we had to leave the hotel, and I went across the street and was wondering what was going on, and I bumped into a reporter friend of mine that I'd worked with before on the street, who was there reporting for the Orlando Sentinel about what was going on, and he's the one who told me why we had to leave the hotel. But you had some experience in Washington after that. Tell us a little about that experience.
Right. So I had kind of a unique experience in the military, in that I joined the infantry, and I spent 2 years with a rifle company in North Carolina, and I did a deployment overseas with them. And then I get back, and I'm assigned to this. Me and a number of other guys from my battalion were assigned to this kind of this really eccentric, esoteric kind of chemical biological weapons unit that had just been started up, that had just been formed just a few years prior, and was still sort of getting itself together. And it was initially based in North Carolina, and then the unit picked up and moved to just south of Washington, D.C. in Maryland. And the whole responsibility of the unit was to go into places that had been attacked by chemical and biological and somewhat whimsically to nuclear weapons, and evacuate casualties. That was our entire job. We had an alert status. We carried pagers, and if something were to come up, the pager would go off, and you had to be within an hour, and you had to come back and respond to whatever threat was out there. We had a lot of drills on this, and a lot of training and different kinds of hazmat gear. I learned how to use an SCBA and how to dress in. If anybody's ever seen Contagion or Outbreak, I was dressing in those same kinds of suits and going into buildings and pretending to drag casualties out. Well, then 9/11 happens, and then those letters are sent to those buildings in D.C., the Longworth Hall. Patrick Leahy and Tom Daschle's office as senators. And well, we were called up to take care of that, to be involved in that process. There were no casualties to evacuate, thankfully. But what we ended up doing is going room to room in every single one of the office, every room in that office complex, and taking samples of dust from the carpets and desks to see which offices had been contaminated and which hadn't been. And it was something of it was an interesting experience, because you were walking into Congressman's office, and they had just, at a snap of the finger, were evacuated, and everything was as it was. There was solitaire up on the computers, there was faxes coming in, there was phone calls, and there was, TV on, cable news on the televisions mounted to the walls. It was very much as they had left it, and it was a little eerie in that way. But yeah, we spent about a week doing that, and we worked there, and then we worked at a mail facility nearby, and sort of helping the local authorities and the FBI sort of gather evidence and kind of come to some sort of conclusion on what that was about.
Mm-hmm. And all those years you were serving, you had this desire in your heart to actually see action.
I did.
Yeah. And where did that come from? And tell us sort of the progress of where you went from your last station to active duty or to duty in Iraq.
Well, my interest in it came from just my childhood. Like I said, I had studied Vietnam and World War II, not quite like a scholar, nothing that disciplined, but I was definitely fascinated with the stories of it, and I wanted to participate in my own version of that. I didn't necessarily want war to occur, but if it did, I was not going to shy away from going, and I certainly didn't in my case. In fact, I kind of leaned toward it once it happened, and so. Yeah, that's something that I explored. I'm curious about. I don't think it's an ugly end of my personality, or perhaps it is. It's certainly not meant to be a violent one. I had no interest in hurting anyone. I just wanted to experience. Excuse me. I just wanted to experience that environment. I wanted to be I wanted to be somebody who was at the leading edge of history, as I referred to it. And war is that in a lot of ways. So what I ended up doing is I considered staying in the infantry. I had some advanced training as a small unit leader, but I had a real fascination with photography and what we sort of now refer to as new journalism. I'd been reading a lot of Joan Didion and Gay Talese and Hunter Thompson and that sort of thing. And so I thought, maybe I should pursue that. And the military has a field for that to a certain extent. It's not nearly that verbose, but I became a combat correspondent, and I felt that one of the motivations for that, aside from what I just mentioned, was it gave me the chance to observe a war while also participating in it. I was going to get to see I was going to get to look at the larger canvas of it. I was able to, I was going to be able to speak with people who planned them, who fight them, and as well as, experience what goes on in a war. I would be very similar to just a typical war correspondent. I would just happen to have a rifle, and I would be a Marine at the same time. So as far as the ethics of journalism go, it's very, very muddy. And I wouldn't classify myself a war correspondent in that way by virtue of the fact that I had a rifle in my hands. But that was something that was really interesting to me. And so once I became a correspondent, I just tried to place myself in situations that would allow for me to be deployed overseas. And finally, on a long enough timeline, I did 7 months in East Africa. And then I ended up with a rifle battalion that was the same. Ironically enough, it was the same rifle battalion I started with. There was a few faces there that I recognized. And I spent my last deployment overseas in the upper Euphrates River Valley up near the Syrian border. Basically, at the time, it was controlled by the insurgency, and had been under. There had been a lot of heavy fighting up there after the Battle of Fallujah, because all the insurgency ran up that river, and it was also kind of a Ho Chi Minh Trail of sorts for the insurgency in Iraq. So there was a lot of fighting up there. The first three and a half months, it was a lot of lead flying in the air.
Yeah. Could I ask you to turn to page 150 in your book, and let's go into one of those narratives of you on the ground there.
Sure.
Page 150, paragraph starting, the bespectacled Marine mechanic. And read that paragraph to the end, please.
Sure. The bespectacled Marine mechanic I know is not. He shows me the burn on his shoulder where a bullet grazed him. When he does, I see the deadness of it in his eyes, as if he's seen past the darker side of some equation beyond his control. And there is the Marine I meet who has been shot in the head by a sniper. In a twisted sense of irony, his name is Snipes. He lives because his helmet saved his life, adjusting the mathematics in his favor at the last moment, the bullet piercing only his wits. Another Marine who stands next to me on a rooftop one gray afternoon, shot in the chest. He is spared by his rifle buttstock and the thick ceramic plate in his body armor. But for a long time, he sits inside the house on bags of USAID rice and frets when his buddies keep asking if he's okay. They might stop if it weren't for his pale, wide eyes that drill into the gray concrete of the foyer wall, silently running the numbers of his own impermanence. Another Marine is shot by an AK-47. The bullet has found the right trajectory to firmly enter his body, giving him a jolt. I got shot in the buttocks, he hollers, our own Forrest Gump, as he's carried from the roof.
Mm-hmm. And later in that same chapter, you describe where one of your comrades is killed with an IED. How difficult was that to write those death narratives in your memoir? And also, you write, death as an action and as a story always bleeds between the seams and makes liars of our composure. So address the first question. How difficult was it to write that and to get that into a spot where you felt like you were writing it truthfully? And then we'll come back to the second question.
That particular scene was a lot longer, and the reason it went through in very, very graphic detail what happened to that Marine. And the reason why I did that, one, I was inspired by something Sebastian Junger had done in A Perfect Storm, where he describes a man drowning. And he's speculating, but he's using research and reporting to form his speculation. And it's brilliantly done. And I was sort of taken the same way. I wanted to show what it was like to see a man, what it was like, what it would feel and look like for a man to roll across an improvised explosive device and have it kill him. Because I think that we had a tendency to sort of maybe diminish that because it's an ugly thing to think about. For me personally, like, I did not write it for a sense of, for some sort of instrument of therapy. I wrote it because I wanted to point out and show what this was. Like, it's incredibly important for us to understand what happens to a person in this context. I tried not to get gratuitous, and I didn't want that, because I think that would have been a little bit exploitative. But I wanted to show that because I thought that it was important that the reader understand what this looks like and what this feels like as best as I can translate it. Yeah, I mean that's really it. It's mimesis. It's turning reality into art, and I'm trying to do that in a way that really brings it really viscerally to the reader.
Hmm. Hmm. And you also write, death as an action and as a story always bleeds between the seams and makes liars of our composure. It's a beautifully written line, but explain sort of what you mean by that.
I think death, because it lives so much in the background of war. On average, a typical Marine had a pretty good chance of going home okay. That was sort of a bit of mathematics that I run even in the moment, somewhat morbidly. But that doesn't mean, but there's still a lottery that's occurring there, and it's all by chance. Nobody seeks to be wounded. Very few people do, and the people who do, we name high schools after. We award very, very, very honorable medals to, but the majority of people who are wounded, they're victims of wounds or casualties. But that fear lives in the background, and the stories we tell about those things, and the way we sort of try to resolve those things within us as we go house to house in an urban combat, or drive on long routes that could be mined, can break down people's ability to deal with reason. It can that fear and that understanding that the next pothole could kill me, it attrits a person. It is an attrition of the soul in a lot of ways. It's an attrition of composure, attrition of dignity in a lot of ways too. I would say the majority of Marines are really good at it, but sometimes these things come out in ways that are unexpected. They do for me in the book, and I think that's a lot of what I meant there, is that it is a corrosive agent, and it strips away a lot of the veneers that we have, a lot of our machismo and bravado.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to remind our listeners that you can send questions in with the chat, and we're going to get to those questions after I ask one more. So Jerad, you've read other war memoirs or novels based on the experience of other writers who've experienced war. And in each age, each war seems to have its own unique elements. Tell me, what are the defining characteristics or themes or elements of the forever war, as you've termed it, that are different from World War II, Korea, Vietnam?
I think the biggest thing is the disengagement. These are wars fought by a volunteer army. That means that people who want to go, that serve, want to do so, and they sort of take on the burden of the war from the average American who is not obligated to engage with our foreign policy, and that's a big part of these wars. Vietnam, the average American could be drafted to fight in that war, especially if you were on the lower income status. You could end up very easily fighting in that war. You'd be forced to go, or go to jail, or flee to Canada. Korea was something similar to that effect. World War II was a crusade, quite frankly. And people wanted to go just as much as they were drafted to go. This war, it was done on the cheap. It was done without oversight from the average American voter, and it was sort of phoned in for basically 2 decades. And I think that those are its driving characteristics. It was done by an incredibly professional class of soldier, probably the most we've ever seen in our country's history. But it was also done, it was sort of those energies and virtues were expended without a real tangible goal or a general interest in the population who was funding them.
Okay. Claire, you want to step in and ask some of the questions from our listeners now?
Sure, and thank you both so much for the conversation so far. We have several questions from our audience, so we're going to do our best to get to as many of them as we can. So I'm going to start back kind of at the beginning, because conversation started talking about your youth, Jerad. And so you were specifically you read that scene of the high school, or the choir experience of you singing in the high school, and an audience member asked, as they were hearing you describe that experience, they're wondering if you have any ideas about redeveloping a definition of patriotism through our schools. And so the process that happens, in schools in America, do you have any ideas for one process of developing patriotism that's more meaningful than maybe the one that kids are learning and picking up by osmosis today?
That's a fantastic question. I love this. We have a tendency to think that the only way to be patriotic is to pick up a gun and fight overseas. And that's literally one method of thousands. I really don't understand our culture and how our culture has come to not treat, or why our culture doesn't treat somebody who works at a food bank as a patriotic individual, or somebody who doesn't, do a food drive or work in some capacity that helps their community, thrive and prosper. And those are patriotic things. Being helpful to the communities you live in and being inclusive and responsive to the needs of a community is incredibly patriotic. And it is far more helpful than I think carrying a rifle overseas and engaging in violence, on the foreign policy that's designed to help someone else. I think that's what you should teach. That's what children should be taught. Is patriotism is helping ourselves. It is helping ourselves. It is bringing everybody into the fold. It is helping people, and even in the smallest way. All politics are effectively local, and therefore patriotism is also local. And I think that's something that should be taught.
Thank you for that. Switching gears a little bit, kind of going along the student kind of thread, an anonymous attendee says, someone who read the book here, so I take it they had either a full day or an early copy. And they wanted to know, Jerad, when you were living in California as a teen, what was your impression of other students or friends who were raised outside of the military bubble? And were there any immediate differences that struck you then, or that reflecting on now, that you can kind of recognize as an adult?
It's interesting. I think one of the big themes is that I lived in Palmdale, California, which it was in the mid 90s, and we had taken a lot of money out of the defense budget. And there's a huge defense contractor base there for a long time. And I had a friend there whose father had worked in one of the major defense firms in some capacity, and lost his job. And he was working 2 jobs just to feed his family, and they were in poverty. And there's a misconception that what I began to realize is there's a huge misconception about why people enlist. There's this idea that people enlist in the military to get out of economic straits. Well, it's both statistically and spiritually just incorrect. The highest number of people enlistees always come from the middle class in a modern military. The smallest numbers comes from the upper echelons of wealth and the absolute impoverished. They tend to join the military the least. So it takes something a little bit more. There's got to be a little bit of an extra jump into that. And I think a lot of it for me was I had exposure to it. Even while I was in California, I went out and watched the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, fight the 1st Cavalry Regiment in the tank battle, because I just had some access to do so and was given the privilege of seeing that. It was a really wild experience as a 15-year-old. But those folks didn't have that. They never had that connection. The military was something that was draconian and off-putting. It was an absolute. It was violent, and it was also a political weapon used against other people in their minds. So there was just not a lot of psychic connection they had to the military, other than negative ones. I hope that answers it.
Yeah, thank you. I think I can't remember the percentage off the top of my head, but because of the volunteer force, the percentage of people who actually have a family member in the military or serve themselves is just tiny now in this country. So that makes sense.
Right.
This question comes from Stephen from the audience, and I'm just going to read it exactly as he submitted it. He said, I was drafted for Vietnam, but received a medical deferment. And I always wondered if I missed an experience as fundamental to manhood, like Achilles or Sergeant York. Do you feel that going to war is a necessary and fundamental element of becoming a man?
That's an interesting question. And, that's one that I wrestled with a lot when I was in the military, because there was a time when I thought that I wasn't going to go to Iraq. And I wondered if I was going to ask those same questions. And I think that that's a trap in a way. I think it's Vietnam being what it was, I think that Stephen, I think you're probably better off for having not gone. From what I understand of Vietnam, my grandfather was in Vietnam, and of all the wars, that was the darkest, and it was the most violent and ugliest. And I can speak to that confidently. But no, that's a good question. I think that war ends up becoming a testament to manhood, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be one. I don't think it's an absolute. We are deciding in our culture, in aspects of our culture, that war equals manhood, or that violence equals manhood in that context. And I struggle with that. I know that I don't think that me going to the Iraq War would have made me more of a man. It was just an experience that I wanted to have. Now, when I was younger and I had a moment where I almost was disqualified from enlisting, that was a testament to manhood in a certain respect, because I was living up to expectations that people had of me, and those expectations were in danger of not being met, and I was terrified that my identity was going to be threatened. So I don't know. I think there's a you can find yourself in a trap with that sort of thinking. I think that kids should be exposed to a lot of different forms of life, and perhaps the military is one of those. And if they are attracted to it, then they should do so, but with the understanding that there are other ways of living their life too.
Thank you for that. We just had a question come in kind of inspired by what you were just talking about from an anonymous attendee. And they say, in your book, you talk a bit about the procedural aspects of Marines training. You talk about how that can sometimes get in its own way. So they're curious about, do you think that the institution needs to modernize or adapt, or has it modernized and adapted, since you were going through training? And if so, how has that happened?
I can't speak to whether or not it's occurring now. In fact, I doubt it is, based on what I see. I think that being an enlisted man means you're living in a very Lord of the Flies experience, if people understand the reference. And the further down the ranks you go, the more somewhat silly it can become. Mission creep is a statement that comes from the lower enlisted, quite frankly. I mean, and I don't know. I think that for the Marine Corps, I think that one of the things that got in the Marine Corps' way was it needed to prove itself to itself. It constantly wanted to show that it was tough, but it only did it for the people within it. And I always wondered about that. I always thought that was a little silly, because it's very good at what it does. If you need a wall knocked down, that's the force you want to call to do that. And they're trained very well. They know how to do that with an incredible efficiency and violence. I never understood the need to bolster their confidence by self-aggrandizing. I always thought that was a little silly. I'm like, if you're really good at it, you don't need to say it. And I think that sometimes that sort of braggadocio gets in the way of smart training, or just having a smarter experience in the military sometimes.
Thank you. And I just want to say to the audience, if you have any lingering questions, you've been typing in and not quite hitting submit, now's the time to do it as we start to wrap up this evening. But I wanted to save this question for towards the end, and another good one just came in. So we're going to save that other question for a minute. But another attendee said that they really liked the question answer about that. Your definition of patriotism, which extends beyond necessarily picking up a gun, although that might be one way that someone expresses their patriotism, and instead focuses on serving local communities. And they were curious about if you have ideas about how that definition of patriotism can be expanded beyond America's borders to show the best of American patriotism to maybe some parts of the world you were talking about that don't necessarily view America as positively.
It's a fantastic question, and I'm a big believer in I've become a believer in the idea that you have to lead by an example, by setting an example to a degree, and you have to show that we are the country we profess to be overseas in all of our literature. The brochure of America is it's the inscription on the Statue of Liberty. We don't tend to live that very well, though. Because you're tired, you're weak, you're hungry, you're huddled masses. We tend to sort of discard that on some sort of dubious sense of nativism. I think that's one way. We espouse a lot of values about democracy and then erode democracy in countries that do not support our value sets. I think that that's wrong. I think a little bit of to sort of show a little bit of a nerd side of me, I suppose. I'm a big believer in a kind of a Star Trek Prime Directive attitude about other cultures. Don't do harm to other people. Do not influence the actions and behaviors of another culture. Allow them to come to the table on their own terms. And I think that's one way to really demonstrate, like patriotism. Like I said, patriotism isn't loud. It's quiet. Good patriotism is quiet. It doesn't need to demonstrate itself. Demonstration of patriotism means that there's a lack of confidence in your belief set, or you need to, blow yourself up into something that's probably a little hollow.
And as the last questions from the audience, and then I'll turn it back over to Chris for any final thoughts. But I just wanted to read this one exactly as it came in. So this is from Elizabeth, and she says she can't wait to read the book. And she says, as the mom of a former Army Special Forces soldier, a Green Beret, she's interested in your take on the volunteer military we have in the U.S. So there's two-part question here. So is a volunteer military the right way to go? Is the first one, which we could probably spend an entire hour talking about that. But that's the first part of the question. And her second part is, can you speak more on how media and cultural glorification of the military might be a link between, might link that glorification to the false patriotism that you're talking about? Do you see a link there? And if so, how do you think those things feed into one another?
Well, to the first question on the benefits and merits of the volunteer military, I think that I've been wrestling with this for a while, but I think that one of the mistakes we made in the early 70s was eliminating the draft. I think it just needed to be retooled. I think it needed to become something that was about civil service and not just about military service. It needed to extend, very similar to like the Civilian Conservation Corps and during the Great Depression or something like that, where people are asked to come for a year or maybe just 6 months or maybe over a summer and just help rebuild a road somewhere in another part of the country, or just do some kind of infrastructure or civic work. Like I said, working at a food bank is one example I keep bringing up. But I think that that's something that would be a huge worth to our country. It would eliminate the siloing effect of our cultures. We would have experiences with people who are out from different parts of our nation. Our nation's huge, and we have a tendency to lose our sense of joined identity because somebody in New York acts a certain way that we disagree with, or has a set of value sets that are advertised as being antithetical to our own. Or vice versa. Somebody from my, where I'm living now could think of somebody in Oklahoma as a simple individual who doesn't have very good politics. And I think that when you get those two people in the room and you have them working together and you see the shared experience, that those things begin to diminish dramatically. Now, as far as our culture goes, as it relates to war, absolutely. I think that one of the best examples and one of the most less than subtle examples of the proliferation of the military as a singular form of patriotism is the AR-15 rifle. Now, I have no interest in dragging gun owners necessarily. I think that that is a right that the Constitution offers, and they're exploring that. But I think that the AR-15 specifically, its proliferation and the timing of it, which occurs basically in 2004, you start seeing video games built around it. Call of Duty and that sort of thing. Those first-person shooters which reflect the war and the way those weapons are used in those wars. I saw a New York Times article a few years ago of a young man in the Midwest who had bought an AR-15 because he wanted to, because that's what weapons overseas, soldiers overseas were carrying. He wanted that connection to what he was seeing on television, what he was seeing in film. And so I think that that's where we've seen the war come home and exploited ways, we put it that way, because I think that the image of that weapon has been exploited by people who don't have our best interest at heart always.
Thank you. And thank you to the audience for all of your just really wonderful questions. And Chris, I just wanted to bring you back in for any final thoughts as we wrap up this evening. And if you haven't already done so, you can purchase a copy of Jerad's book at the link in the chat. It's, again, there's so much more in the book than what we were able to listen to tonight. And I really encourage you to buy it and to read it and to really spend some time with it.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Claire. Thanks, Jerad, for standing and taking questions. I would recommend all the listeners that you do get a copy of the book. It is so well done. For a first effort, it's really outstanding, I think. And it really does give a sense, me as a person who was not in the military, it gives me a sense of what it was actually like on the ground now. I've come away understanding a lot more than I did before I read the book. So thanks, Jerad, for actually writing that. I think that you've done a service to readers by writing a book that's so clear and truthful, I think. And that's it. So thanks.
Thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun, and thanks for those really kind words. That's really meaningful. Thanks. I really appreciate that.
And everyone, if you enjoyed tonight's talk with Atlanta History Center, we have lots more virtual and in-person now, slowly getting back to events coming up. You can find those at atlantahistorycenter.com. Next week, we will be joined by historian H.W. Brands for his newest book, which is called Our First Civil War. And it's about patriots and loyalists in the American Revolution. So going all the way back to the origins of our military there. So if you enjoyed tonight's conversation, again, that's next week on Zoom on the 17th. It's free and it's just right here virtually from your living room or wherever you're calling in from. So Chris and Jerad, thank you again so much for making the time, joining us virtually in Atlanta tonight. We really appreciate it. And Jerad, I'm sure you have lots more of these events coming up. So thank you for joining us on publication day, and best of luck with the rest of your tour.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Have a good night.
And for those folks who haven't visited the Atlanta History Center, if you're really interested in military history, you should go. It has an outstanding collection from Civil War forward, interviews with veterans from every war. You should really check it out.
Yeah, our Veterans History Project, you can find that on our website. We've sat down with over 800 veterans of a variety of conflicts and are continuing to expand that to preserve these stories and make sure we really understand what those experiences are like. So if you know a veteran in your life and you think they might be interested in that, atlantahistorycenter.com has that information. Thank you, Chris. Good night, everyone.